So I was born in Vienna, Virginia. I'm one of the few people who are actually native to the DC metro area. I did all my graduate studies out in California, though. I went to John F. Kennedy University for my graduate degree and the California Institute for Integral Studies for my postgraduate work in somatics, and then a wide variety of just other kind of studies in the psychology field out in California. And then moved back from California in about 2000, 2001, first living in Maryland, then in West Virginia, and then back to Maryland, then DC, and now I'm a Virginia resident, which is where I started my life in Virginia. My background is as a marriage and family therapist. I did my graduate studies in transpersonal counseling psychology and my postgraduate studies in somatic or body-oriented psychology and health psychology. I transitioned from that to coaching, which I also do as well, and then the transpartisan social entrepreneurship work, which I also do. And I've been doing since about 2001, which is the first coalition that I created in the transpartisan space, which is, generally speaking, bringing liberals, conservatives, libertarians, progressives together on a wide variety of issues, but my first issue is around medical privacy. The thing that kind of connects all my work is it seems, if you listen to my history, therapy, the coaching, the transpartisan work, how's it all connected? It's all connected, at least for me, in a recognition that what we need is more sustainable and integrated approaches for human development, for institutional development, and for systemic development. So each of my pieces of work either fit into one of those three realms, either working with individuals, couples, families, or groups, and then the groups is part of institutions, and the institutions are part of systems. And that's kind of where the policy work comes in, because at the policy level, you're really working both on institutions and systems, which then affects individuals. So in my mind, I bridge those three kind of areas in various aspects of my work, but all my work is related to kind of the sustainable and integrated development in those three spaces. And that's kind of like the kind of operating philosophy that I have, as well as, I would say, kind of freedom. So freedom for the individual. So as a therapist and then as a coach, freedom from cultural programming that limits one's ability to act freely in their lives, to help them thrive, be successful, be happy, healthy, and productive, whatever that means for them. Freedom in the political sense, I happen to lean much more libertarian, so I want to limit the coercive power of the state so people can organize cooperatively and help solve their own problems, as opposed to having the state or utilizing the force of the state to solve people's problems. So freedom is also kind of a principle that kind of guides my work, as well as the sustainable and integrated development of those kind of three spheres I mentioned earlier. Obviously, there are limitations to our founding fathers' vision. They grew up in an agricultural time. They didn't have, there was slavery, obviously. Women were second-class citizens. A lot of those problems still need to be addressed. So I'm not saying they were perfect. They were not. They were human beings. But they had a really good vision for us. And the vision was us as self-governing people. The Constitution would limit federal power. There'd be experiments at the state level, 50 experiments. The more we can experiment, and I just don't mean experimenting through the government at the state level, but experiments, like how can we get together as communities to solve our problems? I would love to fulfill our vision of doing that. More people coming together to, in fact, not necessarily going to the state to solve the problem or the federal government, maybe using the resources, but coming together to solve real problems. Like, how can you make people healthier, more educated? How can you clean up the environment? All these problems that affect everyone on a daily basis. So my vision would be those more people coming together to do that. In order to do that, though, I think we need to rethink a lot of things. We need to rethink our economic system. We need to think our consumer-based system, because it's hard for people to come together when they have to work two jobs, broken families. There are a lot of social issues that we also have to address. I would say we have to address almost parallel with solving some of these other problems, because they might be the basis of some of these other problems. So one of the things I think we need to think about is consumerism. I'm very fascinated by kind of these movements out in the culture, what I call cutting edge movements. And you have them in food, you have them in fitness and healthcare and education. You also have them in what we call minimalism and simplicity. There's a growing number of people who recognize that buying more stuff to fulfill some hole in your heart or your soul doesn't fill the hole in your soul. That Madison Avenue does a real good job of exploiting us to make us feel less than, so we have to buy more stuff to make ourselves feel better. It lasts for a few minutes because we have that dopamine rush, and we feel like the same person we used to be, so we have to buy more stuff. So, I think as a sociocultural phenomenon, that needs to be addressed too, not through force of the government, just through a awakening of the people, that if we buy less stuff in terms of goodies in the economy, we will probably have to work less. If we work less, we're spending less time, 2 hours in traffic going to work, 2 hours in traffic going home, blah, blah, blah. We have more time with our families. We have more times in our communities. We have more time to get together to solve problems. I think the way we've structured ourselves in terms of our industrial capitalist paradigm is actually destructive to those ends. The fact that both parents, if you're lucky enough to have both parents, sometimes it's a single parent home, have to go to work. And they have to spend hours in traffic. And they come home, they're stressed out, understandably. There's no value judgment. That's just the way we've structured our society. I think we have to address kind of those underlying issues of industrial capitalism and consumerism, which will then help us create more time for family. And when I say family, I just don't mean the nuclear family. I mean the broader family and the community. And we also will have more time as a community to get together to solve problems too. So I mentioned to you that I'm a libertarian, but I would say I have libertarian sensibilities. I might consider myself more of a conservatarian with green sensibilities, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, as a libertarian, my basic premise is I want to use cooperation as the basis of human relationships, not force. So people should be free to come together to organize themselves as they see fit to solve problems in the social space, in the economic space, however they want to organize themselves for their purpose in their own lives, without the force of government. Because my concern is government uses force or the threat of force to impact individuals, families, and communities. They can jail you, they can steal your property, and they actually do steal your property. I mean, there are lots of cases, especially in the drug war as an example, where they just take property, and they can kill you. That can't happen in other institutions. The state is the only institution that can do those three things legally. So, I want to limit that kind of power that they have over us as individual Americans. And I say I'm a conservatarian, so in the conservative side of things, my conservative kind of beliefs precede the Judeo-Christian belief system. So when I might call myself a social conservative, but not in the way that most Americans would think of social conservatism. I go back not 2,000 years or 3,000 years, but I go back tens of thousands of years, and I look at evolutionary biology as a framework, and I say, what is appropriate for us as human beings in terms of the habitats we should live in, the kind of life that's beneficial for us for optimal functioning and health and community building. And that's kind of the framework that I use. So when I say I'm conservative, it's a conservative looking way back historically, almost pre-agriculture, and saying what's appropriate for us biologically. And then the green side of things is I'm very ecologically sensitive. And I think one of the limitations of the conventional libertarian movement is it's very agentic. It looks at only the individual. And it doesn't take necessarily, except through some property rights discussions, the collective or the ecology into consideration. And I think that's a huge mistake because, without our biosphere, we all die. And so we need to take into consideration anything that we do as individuals and collectively, what impact do we have on the environment? Because it is a good in and of itself, and it's just a good for our own survival long term. So that's kind of like my green libertarian conservatism packaged together in a quick explanation. So, and there are other people like me that I've run across in the 20 plus years of doing this kind of work. I was fortunate in early 2000s to be invited by Ken Wilber to join something called the Integral Institute. Ken Wilber is a philosopher. He's written about 20 books or so on what's called integral philosophy. And through that, I've met a lot of really interesting people who are thinking about political philosophy, social philosophy, what we might be called kind of a postmodern philosophy or an integrated philosophy that takes into consideration the individual, takes into consideration the ecological systems we are embedded in, the social systems we're embedded in, the various cultures we're embedded in, or actually are embedded in us as meaning making. So there's a lot of really interesting people out there that I benefit from knowing and learning from, who are either working on this kind of meta philosophy, taking all these things in consideration, or working on very specific pieces of it. So I attempt to follow as closely as possible, like the latest thinking and findings in psychology and sociology, anthropology, the various social sciences, the various physical sciences, and then see, okay, there's this really great amount of research coming out. How do you integrate it all together? And we're human beings, so we're limited in our knowledge, and we're always learning new things, hopefully. But taking all this information, integrating it together, and coming up with a much larger map or model of what it is to be human, what it is to be a human being on this planet, and how we can best live on this planet and thrive as a species on this planet. And one of the driving forces for me is trying to understand how individuals and systems and institutions can change more towards more sustainable integrated models or ways of operating. And so that, so when I look at all the different systems of science and the social science, this is kind of like why. I'm looking at these saying, okay, this is interesting. This is what we now understand about the brain. How can I utilize that either in my work with an individual or couples or groups? How can I bring into my work in my, whether I'm consulting for an institution or policy down the street in Washington, D.C., in order to facilitate positive change in a much better direction. And it's a great time to be alive and a challenging time to be alive, because now we have access to the wisdom traditions and the science, Western science and ancient wisdom, the religious systems, which have a lot of wisdom to offer us if you kind of move beyond some of their limitations. So it's a really good, cool time to be alive, to kind of look at all these things, integrate them together, and see how we might utilize that wisdom, that knowledge, to move us forward in a good direction. So one of the vehicles I use for the transformational change that I'm trying to work through and on for my whole life, basically, is as a transpartisan social entrepreneur and working on policy here in Washington, D.C. And for folks who don't know what the transpartisan movement is or the transpartisan philosophy is, there are a couple different ways of considering it or thinking about it, but I'll just name a few, and then I'll walk through a few case studies which might prove the case of why this is an important way of thinking about the world. Unfortunately, if you just watch the talking head shows or pay attention to political parties, you're under the mistaken belief that there's a spectrum called left and right, and you must land somewhere on the spectrum. Either you're liberal or you're conservative, or maybe you're conservative libertarian or you're liberal progressive, but it's a spectrum. And that binary choice is inaccurate. It's limited. It doesn't really reflect the true complexity which is available to us and actually operating in our world today in terms of worldviews and perspectives on how the world is and could be. So we need a much larger map. So transpartisan is one way of thinking about transpartisan. It's a much larger map that takes into consideration the multiple worldviews, not just this binary left and right thing, which is interesting in and of itself because, like I said, it gives the recognition to dozens of other worldviews which are really important to take into consideration when policy is being discussed and decided upon. Another way to consider transpartisanship is it's a way of doing three things. It's humanizing the political process because it's seeking both debate and dialogue. So it's about sitting together with people from the other sides, and it's not the other side, it's the other sides, with a plural, because there's multiple different sides, and engaging in a conversation with them, trying to understand why they believe what they believe, what their worldview is, how we can operationalize the worldview in a larger dynamic, in the transpartisan dynamic. So it's humanizing the political process, because not only is that good in and of itself, but a piece of that too is also getting to know the other people. So it's not just like, oh, let's have solving this particular issue. It's also getting to know other people. So there's a deeper level than just like, oh, I want to get to know you so I can figure out how to work with you to solve this one issue. No, I want to get to understand where you come from, who you are, connect with you as an individual. So it's not just transactional, it's transformational, it's relationship-based. So it's humanizing the political process. It's finding common ground, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. It's amazing once you get people talking with one another kind of in a safe environment where they're not disrupted by the latest breaking news, and and they don't have to worry about their funders behind them listening to everything they say, or their constituents listening to everything they say, and their kind of defenses get dropped because they don't need to have them, and they engage in a conversation with a second party. There's so much more common ground available to us when we have those kind of conversations than not. And I've found like there's pretty much 90% common ground once you start engaging in a conversation. So it's not just, two people getting together and I have my idea, you have your idea, and we kind of fight it out and try to find some common ground. But the third thing that's really interesting is when you decondition the mind, kind of let loose a little bit and have that kind of conversation, a third idea can enter the space. So it's not just my idea, it's not just your idea, but this new idea can emerge. And that's where creativity can come in, which is so much needed, especially here in Washington, D.C., because people are really stuck in their particular perspectives, the means that they seek to the ends, and they fight to the death toward these things. And that's not really helpful. So by kind of creating the space for kind of innovation and creativity, it creates the opportunity at least for new ways of dealing with old problems, which is wonderful. So it's humanizing the political process, it's finding common ground, and hopefully creating new space in the body politic for new ideas. So those are kind of two ways of thinking about the transpartisan. And if you actually look at the word transpartisan, it's through and beyond the partisan. So we're not saying like, oh, don't believe your particular worldview or perspective. We all tend to be tribal. No matter how open-minded we are, we still have boundaries to our belief systems. There's still an us, even though the us might be huge, and a them. So we're not saying, oh, you have to give up completely any of these kind of boundaries you might have or your tribal identification, because that's just natural to us. It's innate in us. I think it's kind of evolutionary. But if you can kind of recognize that your tribal identity is just an identity, just one of many identities, your belief system is, maybe you believe it to be 100% accurate, but you can also recognize that you're a human being, so you don't know everything. So maybe you're 99% accurate in terms of your understanding of the world and how it should actually be. And kind of that is very helpful in engaging these kind of transpartisan processes. One thing I just kind of want to go back over is I mentioned that in the transpartisan space versus the bipartisan space. In the bipartisan space is debate. Debate, I'm right, you're wrong, name calling, I'm smart, you're an idiot, whatever you want to do. In the transpartisan space, debate is good. I think it properly done, not calling people names, but debating ideas. But it's also about dialogue. In order to dialogue, you must actually cooperate. There must be a relationship, because you must be able to trust the other person to engage in that kind of deeper understanding of where they're coming from, where are you coming from, the shared space between you. And that cooperative model, and like I said, there's nothing wrong with competition, there's nothing wrong with debate, I think that's important too. But we need much more cooperation in order to actually solve the problems that we have. And I think the transpartisan model is a good way of thinking about how we can come together and start cooperating. And because what I find is not only you guys can come together to solve or come together to find some common ground to solve a policy issue, but the more people come together to solve policy issues, they don't necessarily have to start looking outwards towards a policy solution that they want the government to do at the state level or federal level or the local level. They can actually start looking at each other and go, well, we live in the same community. Maybe we can come together and start cooperating to solve the problem locally with ourselves. Maybe they need to go to the government for some resources, but it's not just about going to the government and creating a new bureaucracy to solve a particular problem. It's like, oh, now that we're cooperating to do something over here in terms of the policy space, can we recognize that we can actually cooperate to solve a local problem? And that solving of the local problem can also help you solve a larger problem, a state problem or a federal problem or a national problem or a global problem. But it's that cooperation that's kind of necessary as the kernel for that ability to emerge to actually really solve problems down the road. So it's transformational, it's not transactional, it's relationship-based. And one more thing just about cooperation. I mentioned earlier that I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist. And that's one framework I use when I think about the policy work. We're a big family. And cooperation at the family level is really important, obviously, if you're going to solve interpersonal problems and create a healthy dynamic within a family, whether it's a couple and children or whatever the dynamic happens to be. That's the same kind of thinking that I utilize when I think about the policy at the national level. You need that kind of cooperation, that kind of connection, that kind of relationship in order to really solve problems. I know some of the pushback that I've heard is like, oh, cooperation sounds nice, it's idealistic, but that's not how the world actually works. It's very competitive here in Washington, D.C., as well as other places where politics takes place. And that's true, and that's also not true. Now, if you limit yourself to watching the talking head shows or talk radio, you'll reinforce the mistaken belief that all it is this fighting, 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 fighting. It's kind of binary left, right, stuff. That happens, that's true. However, there's a lot more cooperation behind the scenes than most people would imagine. I've been fortunate to be involved in dozens of coalitions in the past 20 years where, hardcore partisan progressives and liberals and conservatives and libertarians come together and work on policy issues. And, if you watch the talking head shows or talk radio, you wouldn't believe that to be true. But there's a lot of cooperation on a wide variety of issues, whether it's foreign policy or defense policy or civil liberties, transparency in government, healthcare even. A lot of interesting cooperation that I've seen over the past 20 years. And not only that, but there's a lot of partisanship and there's a lot of conflict, but it's not as conflictual as it has been in our past. I mean, we need to take the past in consideration. Think about the late 60s. There were bombings going on in this country because of the Vietnam War. That's pretty hardcore, violent partisanship, right? We obviously had the Civil War, which was very partisanship. So, compared to those two times, yes, we have partisanship, we have strong tribal identities and a lot of conflict. It's not as bad as it has been in the past. We have a lot of examples of people working cooperatively together across the political spectrum to solve problems. And we just need to highlight those more and create more opportunities for people to come together to solve a wide variety of problems that we face as a community, as a nation state, as a species.